All right, hey everyone, we are going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll just wait for a few more people to join us. And we're excited you're all here.
Welcome.
And I would say we can do a quick audio check as well if people can hear us. If you want to pop a hand up in the chat, that'd be great. Excellent. Hi, Bruno. I'm seeing some hands. Daniel, thank you. All right, we're good to go with the audio. All right, well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Plato webinar series. I am Ashley Whitlatch, and I currently lead marketing efforts here at Plato. So if you're joining us for the first time, this is an ongoing series where we address some of the most common challenges engineering and product leaders face. So this time around, we're going to be talking about goals, and specifically, how do you align those individual team goals with that larger company vision? So I've got an amazing expert with me here today to talk through that, Matt Tucker. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about goals with all of you guys. I truly believe that goals process has the ability to transform the way the teams work together, and also to transform what you're able to achieve as a team. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm going to try to use the proper level of humility in this conversation, because I'm pretty sure that I actually sucked at setting goals and living with goals through most of my career. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today are things that I wish had been shared with me much earlier on. And also, of course, even though at Koan, we build software to help people do this stuff, we're just on the journey as well, and we're constantly striving to improve how we set goals and live with them every week.
Yeah, so let me tell you all a little bit more about Matt. He is, as you mentioned, the CEO of Koan, which is a startup building software to empower managers and their teams. So again, experts here. And he previously was the co-founder and CTO of Jive Software, which some of you may have heard. He bootstrapped Jive from 2001 through Series A funding in 2007 and continued it all the way through to IPO, which is really exciting, in 2015. So he has worked with over 1,000 different companies around the world when he was at Jive, and he also holds a BS in computer science from the University of Iowa. So that's a bit more about Matt. So Matt, I'll let you go ahead and take it away and we can dive right in.
Awesome, let's do it. So the agenda, and I guess I should probably kick this off by saying that the title of our webinar is a little bit of a lie, but I hope it's a lie in a good way, because we're not just going to be talking about how to set goals, and we're going to talk about what I call the whole goal life cycle. Setting them, of course, which is an interesting and challenging thing, and specifically in engineering teams. But also how to live with them every week. And then the very important process at the end, which is how do you create a continual positive feedback loop out of your successes and failures. And I think interestingly, in this whole setting goals idea and topic, there's a little bit of a fallacy that is pretty widespread. And that's that there's this assumption that it's mostly just about if we figure out the right goals and write them down, then yada, 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 magic, kaboom, good things will happen. Right. And I think actually the really critical thing is how do we build out a goals process that actually shapes team behaviors? And every single week and that learning process, that entire goal life cycle. And that's where the real power of goal setting kicks in, not just setting them. But that's where we'll start. The what and the why of goals, and we'll talk about the OKR framework and then dig into the rest. So there's many goal frameworks out there. We're going to dig into one specific one, the OKR, or Objectives and Key Results framework. And the main reason for that is it's the one that is out there and incredibly popular. And when you go and do a search for more content and want to read blogs and articles, you're going to find OKRs all day long. But you can also read about SMART goals, and if you work at Salesforce, V2 Moms. And the point of this discussion is not to share the religion of one particular goal setting framework. It's basically to use one framework as a way of talking about the real guts and meat of what it means to set and live with goals. And so most of what we're going to be talking about applies to any goal setting framework you might use. But I do really like OKRs because they're simple, they work, and because there is this huge body of knowledge around them. And the basics of OKRs are really simple. Basically, it's that you take an objective, which is what you're trying to accomplish, and you pair it with a set of key results, which is essentially how you'll measure whether you actually achieve that objective. All right, so let's dig in a little bit more to what an objective is. First, it should be qualitative and inspiring, and we'll look at a few different examples in just a second. But it should, when you state it, be something that might actually motivate your team in an interesting way. And it doesn't need to be fully exact. It's, hey, this is the direction we're trying to go in, not the exact thing we're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, you'll set an objective to be probably quarterly, in some cases monthly. We'll talk about when you might choose different date targets. And if you only have one objective for your team, I think that's totally okay. In most cases, you probably won't want more than 3. And if you're setting objectives for a large company, you probably definitely wouldn't want more than 5. So somewhere in between 1 and 5 at any one time. But the point being, the smaller the number, the better, because that is what actually creates focus. Mm-hmm. All right, so some examples, and some of these are specific to being an engineering leader. It might be ship an amazing MVP. Maybe you're a startup and you haven't released your product yet. And the most important thing for you to do as a company at that stage is to ship a great initial software release. Or maybe you're a little bit later on, or building out some new functionality. And so it could be to have super successful pilots with some specific customers. Maybe you're an engineering team that's struggling with a huge number of incoming support tickets. So it would be to solve our support ticket crisis. You get the idea. Now, the key results are how you're actually going to measure whether you achieve that objective. And the key thing with a good key result is that it's a black and white thing, whether you've actually achieved it. It's measurable and verifiable. And the best way to do that is to use a specific metric that has a number. So 1,000 active users in a private beta. Now, that definitely achieves the measurable and verifiable criteria because you can build out some simple analytics and you know exactly how far along with that specific key metric you are. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of cases where you might need to set what's called a binary key result. In other words, you either have achieved it or not, and we'll talk about when you might choose one or the other. And similar, you probably want a relatively small number of these key results, 3 to 5 at the most for each objective. Less is better. And basically it's, hey, we have a set of key results where if we achieve all of them, then most people would agree that we've achieved the objective. All right, so digging in a little bit to the OKR framework, and so far this all seems very simple, I hope. And of course, the devil's in the details and how you actually live with these things. So John Doerr came out with a book quite recently called Measure What Matters. He also has a TED Talk about OKRs, and I definitely recommend both of them for doing a deep dive on this topic. But he talks about what he calls the OKR superpowers. So I thought we'd dive into those a little bit. The first is a rather obvious thing, and kind of what most people think of as the most basic reason to have goals, which is that it provides focus and actually lets you have a set of priorities. So we know what to work on. We're only working on the most important stuff, and it makes it easier for us to say no to everything else. And the way you actually do this using OKRs is to create the smallest number of objectives possible. And we'll talk about this some more, but there is somehow this natural instinct that we need to set goals for as many things as possible, because if we don't have a lot of goals, we're not working hard enough, or that if we don't have goals that cover all the work that we're doing, somehow that's wrong. And what I would recommend is make goals be about the transformation that you're trying to have in your team, or essentially the change. And if you have too many priorities, really that's the same as no priorities, because nobody knows what to focus on most. Second superpower is this idea of alignment, and especially of connecting teams, disparate teams in your company together. And the way you do that with the OKR framework is to make OKRs transparent to the whole company. So whatever OKRs you set as a team, that you would make those available to everyone else in some central place. And as a leadership team, whether in engineering or for the whole company, that you would start by setting some top level OKRs, but then allow everybody to self-organize and set their own goals for how to achieve the overall objectives. And third, track for accountability. And I think this definitely means accountability in the positive sense, where people feel ownership and want to drive progress because they care about it. And we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about the living with your goals part of the life cycle. But essentially, you should set a lead for each key result, or KR, and then regularly assess the confidence and track your metrics. And then finally, this is the other obvious superpower for goals, which is that you can achieve more than you ever thought possible. And the way you do that with OKRs is that you actually need to make them hard. In Google, they have a 70% rule, which is, hey, we set our KRs to be so difficult that if we were to achieve 70% of our metric, we would consider that to be a full success. And anything over 70% would be a massive, massive win. But a lot of the trick in going through and setting good key results is to figure out the right level of difficulty, because you really do want to stretch beyond where you thought was possible as a team. All right, so a little bit more on why goals and sort of the psychological underpinnings. So there was this great book that came out a few years ago by Daniel Pink called Drive. And the basic, what it basically covers is that some of the old notions of motivation, essentially the carrot and stick approach to getting your employees to work harder and achieve what they're supposed to, really just doesn't work. And it might have worked when we were all working in a factory and just trying to build widgets faster. But when we're dedicated to intellectual tasks, like most of us are, the carrot and stick just doesn't work. And instead of extrinsic rewards, we need to unlock the intrinsic motivation that we all feel as humans. And his main proposal is that we feel that intrinsic motivation when we have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what I would say to all of you is that goals actually become an amazing way of unlocking this intrinsic drive that we all have. So autonomy, that essentially just means As an individual, I have the capability of charting my own course about how to solve a specific problem. Nobody's telling me exactly what to do. They define the what, and I get to decide the how. Mastery means that I'm working on things that I feel like I'm great at and that I continually get to get better at them. And purpose is that the work that I'm doing is connected to some higher ideal. Either I can connect it to the organization's purpose. I feel like I'm part of a team. Basically, that I don't just feel like a cog where whatever I'm working on has no meaning. And these are all relatively obvious things, and a lot of what a good goals process can actually unlock. So we can create autonomy and a feeling of freedom and ownership when we focus more as leaders on just saying, hey, here's what success looks like, and then giving your team and the organization the ability to figure out how they want to achieve it and the ownership to actually achieve it, as well as the clarity of what's most important in the organization so that they can make decisions themselves about what to work on and what not to work on without being told every single task to do. And as you're doing your goal setting and as you're figuring out goals in your organization, if you're feeling that that's particularly challenging to create this sense of ownership and to give each of your teams goals that they can own and drive with a fair amount of autonomy, I think that this is sometimes particularly challenging in engineering. You might have the wrong team structure. And what I mean by that is maybe it's the product team that is always defining what engineering should be building. That's not very fun. And so maybe it's, hey, we just work as this giant group of engineers and nobody owns anything or is accountable to anything. We all just are supposed to contribute in small ways. And so you might think about either embedding product and design with your engineering team so that you can drive at specific goals, or carving up the engineering team into smaller pods so that they can actually have ownership and autonomy of specific parts of the code base. And we can dig into all this a bit more. All right, so how do you set goals? What does it actually look like with a specific process? And there is no one right answer, but I wanted to suggest some simple exercises that you might try with your team. And I think that there's a really interesting exercise that you can try, and this might actually help convince you that you need to set goals more explicitly with your team, which is to try this exercise of asking everybody in the team, what are the 3 most important things that we need to accomplish in the next 3 months? Now at Koan, we've sat down with a lot of leadership teams, whether it's leadership of engineering or executive leadership teams, and we've said, all right, CEO, be quiet for a second. Everybody else, go ahead and name the 3 most important things that you guys need to accomplish as a team. And essentially every single time, everybody says something completely different. And that's even when the team thinks that they've set their goals correctly and that they talk about it all the time. And the CEO is usually jumping out of her seat, super upset, like, all I do is talk about what's most important. How can you guys not remember? So it's a good reminder that this is actually very challenging and that remembering what's most important and continually having that discussion is actually challenging. Second, that if your goals are not the same as actually what's most important, that's probably a bad sign, and that's a relatively easy trap to fall into. And it's like, hey, we have our goals, and then we have our actually most important things, and they should be the same. And then part 3, if you're not sure where to get started, it's actually a really simple and interesting exercise as a way of brainstorming. All right, well, how do we set our initial set of objectives? So generally speaking, this is part 2 now. The objectives are something that you would set either as the leader or as a small leadership team, at least in draft state. And so you would write down, hey, here's what I think our 1 to 3 objectives should be, say, over the next quarter. And then you would ask for feedback. And one specific tip, instead of asking, hey, do you have any questions or comments about these objectives? actually get your team to make some positive suggestions by asking something like, hey, please suggest one or more variations that would improve this objective. And every single time I've ever asked my team this question, they always come up with something better than what I wrote initially. All right, so then you have your objective. It's inspiring. It talks about the direction that you want to head as a team. It makes it clear what the priority is. Now it's time to actually set your key results. And I like having the key results to be a team brainstorm. So you might gather either in the same room or over video chat and take a few minutes to write down KRIDs, ideas on sticky notes or type them up, and then take turns presenting. And after you present them, group them into a few different obvious buckets. And you'll probably find that the ideas around KRs naturally start falling into some great ideas of areas. Invariably, a few people will come up with some ideas that you never would have thought of, and they can end up being really important ways to measure the objective. And then finally, after you have all of that, you can have a debate in the team about the right level of difficulty about the metrics. Is it 1,000 people in the beta? Is it 400? Is it 2,000? What's the right level of difficulty? What's possible? Now, the traditional OKR approach is to have a quarterly schedule for these, and maybe you do a team offsite where you talk about the overall strategy and you do deeper planning, and then you set your quarterly objectives. It's not a fit for every team. And it might be because things are changing very rapidly or you're a startup. If you're finding that the quarterly objectives mean that you just constantly fail at them or have no idea what to set because it feels like the world is changing too quickly, don't feel bad about that. Try setting monthly objectives. Or at Koan, for example, we generally set quarterly objectives, but monthly KRs. We're a startup. We just don't have enough visibility into everything coming over the next 3 months. We know the direction that we're heading, and so we just bite it off 1 month at a time with a set of KRs for each objective to get us part of the way there. I think that's mostly just based on the fact of where we are as a company.
And do you have a suggestion for those listening of, at what stage would you change over to quarterly versus monthly? Is there a set time period, or is it just based on the team? And
I think the more you're trying to do coordination between teams, the more having a little bit more structure around these can be helpful. So if you're a larger organization or larger engineering team, if you have clarity at leadership level of, hey, here's what we're trying to do over the next 3 months, that gives your teams a more solid structure to figure out and self-organize around. All right, now we can set each of our goals. So generally speaking, the larger you are, the deeper your planning cycles can be, and the more synchronization you have to have between teams. Probably is more reasonable that you can set longer-term goals. You can also set yearly goals and yearly objectives, of course. So another fallacy around this whole goal setting is that there should be this beautiful parent-child tree of all of the objectives and KRs in your organization. And I would say that if you end up with that, you're probably doing it wrong. And the main reason for that is manyfold. But one is, if you are doing that, it probably means you're setting goals for all the work and not just the work that is about transforming the organization or about the change you're trying to drive. So a lot of times leadership teams will get together and they'll say, all right, our 2 most important things that we really need to do to change the way our engineering team works or the way our business works are 1 and 2. And then somebody will say, well, what about the operations team or the infrastructure team? Like everything they're working on isn't a part of that. You're like, oh God, that's right. People are going to feel so bad if what they're working on isn't included in our top level goals.
Mm-hmm.
And so you invent another goal, which is about working better together, or something sort of superfluous, just so that everybody can feel good about it. So that's one way that you can end up with a bad set of goals.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can, even if you do it where you set the top level goals as, hey, these really are just the most important things. The reality is a huge portion of your team is going to be working on the stuff that just keeps the lights on.
Right.
So yeah, maybe infrastructure team or the support engineering function just needs to make sure that all the incoming tickets are getting answered, or that the environment stays up. And you have very high levels of standard and quality around doing all of that. But it's not about the change that you're trying to drive in your team. And if you force everybody into thinking, hey, my goals need to fit perfectly into the top level goals, you're going to get some weird behaviors. So I like to think of it as more inspiration rather than this perfect hierarchical thing.
And we were talking about this a bit yesterday with, if people feel really left out, if the manager hasn't done a good job of making the work that they're doing feel part of the company vision. So it might not be part of a specific OKR, but like you said, it's part of that larger company vision. So how would you, I guess, recommend engineering managers or leaders help those individuals that might not be part of that specific goal into feeling like, hey, yes, I'm keeping the lights on, but what else is
important? No, it's a great point, and that's exactly right. And so goals are not the same thing as your team's vision and mission.
Right.
And certainly as a company, I hope that you've written down your vision and mission. But it's also very valuable to write down as a team. And it could be your line manager with your team. You're in charge of mobile engineering. It could be that you're running the entire engineering team, but actually explicitly writing down your mission and vision. That's the North Star that you're always heading towards.
Right.
And of course, everything that folks are working on in your organization should be related to those. And it's one of the ways of answering that, hey, I'm not working on something that's specifically related to the goals.
Right.
Like, that's true, but you're supporting our overall mission so that the rest of these folks have the freedom and flexibility to go and drive this change for us.
Mm-hmm.
So brief conversation about metrics. And we talked about this a little bit. When you're setting a key result, if you can find a way of representing it with a metric instead of a binary, it got done or didn't get done, right, that's a great behavior because we tend to feel more motivated when we can see those metrics changing. It leads to some of the planning exercises and conversations that we want to have. So instead of shipping the new feature, it's get 500 users on the new feature. Or if you've already shipped something and you want to drive a higher percentage of engagement or signups or retention, setting some specific metrics around that. And then the general thing to apply to this is if it's an early effort, it should really be about massive changes. So if you're talking about 20% improvement and it's the first time you're doing something, you're probably not working on the right thing. When it's a brand new feature or product that you're building, you're looking for massive changes, and you should actually challenge yourselves to set really aggressive goals that are still hypothetically possible. And if it's later efforts, you're going to be doing a whole bunch of small optimizations that add up to big impact later. Mm-hmm. And one final thing is, I think a lot of leaders feel like all of their metrics need to somehow be incorporated into goals, and that's just not true. Mm-hmm. Instead, create a set of health metrics. Those are going to be really important. It might be uptime or code coverage, whatever it is, the things that that you constantly need to be doing in order to have a functioning and healthy team, and measure those and report on those on a very regular basis. But only focus on them if they start to become a problem. Mm-hmm. And that gives you the flexibility to make your goals be about the fundamental change rather than just the steady state of what's happening in the team. So you can have your goal metrics, that's about change, and you can have your health metrics, that's about maintaining what you need to be doing as a team.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to do a bunch of quick hits of some advice and maybe questions to ask yourself in the spirit of things that I wish somebody had pounded me on a little bit earlier in my career. And first is, look, you're kind of crazy if you haven't written down in a formal way what your priorities are for your team. And whether you're doing it as OKRs or written goals or just an explicitly published set of priorities, you have to be doing this behavior, because otherwise it means that you're going to be telling every member of your team each individual task that they should be working on.
Right.
You'll get way less out of your team. Nobody will be happy. And nobody will be able to make decisions for themselves about what's the most important thing to be working on. So you got to be doing this. Second thing, and this is back to the top 3 priorities question.
Mm-hmm.
Just try it every once in a while. Can everybody on the team actually state the goals without thinking about it really hard? And I have to admit, at Jive, we're usually not awesome at this. We do all this work to set the goals at the beginning of the quarter. And then if you had asked me at any point in the middle of the quarter, like, hey, what are those goals? I'd sit there and think about it for a few seconds and be like, well, I remember that 2 of them are X and Y, but honestly can't remember what the other 3 are. And that's a bad sign. Mm-hmm. Third is, this is almost always true, you have too many goals. Almost every team that I talk to and do goal setting exercises with, when they first start this out, they write down a goal for all the work that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, it's the same as having no priorities. Too many priorities is the same as no priorities. And so a lot of the challenge of this is, how do you whittle this down to the smallest number of goals possible? Just truly the things that will transform your team.
And do you think also having that, like, it's almost like they're creating a to-do list as opposed to
exactly.
No, they're just using the checkbox.
Exactly, and there is a place for that. And goals are not the same as planning. And once you set your goals, you do need to go through the planning exercise and actually have somewhere probably to record all those tasks that need to get done. And that can live in Jira or Asana or a Google Doc, wherever it needs to live. It's okay to have a plan, and you should have a plan. But that's different than just making your goals be the plan.
Right.
There is often this challenge of the goals not actually being important. And again, that exercise of what's really most important for your team and why. If you've set a set of goals that won't actually lead to some fundamental change and transformation of your team, it means that they're probably not actually the most important things. And so really challenging yourself to find, like, hey, if we accomplish this, does that mean transformative progress for us? If any of your goals don't meet that criteria, just chuck it. It doesn't mean that you don't need to do that work. You probably do, just to keep the lights on, but you don't need to set a goal around it. Which is essentially that next piece of advice. I think challenging yourself to keep asking, hey, does this goals process actually create autonomy for my team? Right. If it doesn't, it probably means goals are at the wrong fidelity, or you haven't organized your team structure in a way where they actually have ownership. Mm-hmm. So keep in mind that notion that, hey, we're setting these goals in order to create autonomy. I'm, as a leader, simply defining the what and then giving my team the ability to figure out how, because they're probably going to figure out a way of accomplishing these things in ways that I would never think about. And ideally, you've hired the folks that will do a better job at it than you ever could yourself.
And I think too, like we touched on this yesterday a bit as well, with the idea of changing and making sure that vision is really clear for different personality types on the team, right? So there's, especially for engineering teams, like there may be some people who are totally happy, you give them a problem and they're happy to just go and tackle that on their own and solve it. And then you have other team members who really want to have that larger sense of purpose.
Yeah, exactly. And goals can tap into many of the pieces of that intrinsic motivation that we can feel. I get to decide how I do the work. I get to be working on things that and have ownership of the things that I care about and that I'm good at. And wow, I can understand how the work that I'm doing is connected to the larger purpose of our team.
Right.
Exactly right. In figuring out difficulty, you might use that 70% rule that we talked about at Google. I like to ask the pretty simple question of, hey, I kind of know something's the right difficulty if I can imagine that it's possible, but we're just not exactly sure how it's possible yet. And that might be a good metric. And finally, in particular, if you're an engineering leader and your only job is to implement what product says that you should do, you probably need to fix that because that's not a very fun job for you or for your engineers. And there's many ways of tackling that, but it's just something to look out for. All right, so let's move on from setting your goals to talking about living with your goals and what it actually means to drive team behaviors week to week. So I do think that there's intrinsic value in just simply writing them down and setting your goals. But there's something much more important that you can actually drive, which is every single week, by living with these goals, we can change the way that we're working together and making decisions, and both achieving more than we thought possible, making better decisions about what not to work on, and doing it all in a way where you're not micromanaging each of your engineers. And so what we're going to talk about with some of my recommended mechanics of how to actually live with your goals is all about not falling into the trap. I put a sad panda on the slide of, hey, we spent all this time at the beginning of the quarter figuring out our goals, and then we never talk about them again until the end. If you do that, then you are only taking advantage of a very small percentage of the value that they could actually provide. So the thing I like to recommend is a pretty simple process, and it's a weekly goals check-in. You may be doing something similar to this already, but it starts off by setting a lead for each of your key results. And if possible, let people raise their own hand to say, I want to be the lead on this key result. It's an awesome way of building accountability and ownership. So you set the KRs as a team, and then everybody on the team gets a chance to say, I want to be the one driving it. It doesn't mean they're the only one working on it, but it means they're the one that is responsible for updating the team and ultimately is going to be held accountable for making sure that it happens. And then, of course, yeah, you can also list out the other people that are contributing to the goal. So you have your leads and your contributors. Then every week, very simple process. First, review and update the metrics for your key results. So if it was 1,000 beta users, where are you at right now? Hopefully you can automate this and put it on a dashboard so they're not doing a lot of work. But however you need to gather the data, make sure that the metric is actually in front of everybody every single week. And then ask for a qualitative reaction from both the leads as well as all the contributors and anybody else that wants to participate. And it's pretty simple. It's, hey, give it a score. And it could be the red, yellow, green scale. It could be the 1 through 10. But it's essentially a confidence score for whether you think that you're going to hit this key result by the date that you said you would. As well as a then short qualitative explanation about why you passed judgment that way. And you're going to get some really interesting results. We'll talk about some of those behaviors that will happen by doing this process. And then as a full team, you actually have to get together and review all that data. And when you do, you're going to have some really interesting discussions. You're going to prioritize and figure out and say, hey, we can't get all of these things done because guess what? There is less time than we thought there was originally. So which of these key results and which of these objectives are we actually going to choose as most important? You'll have that team-wide discussion and decision. You'll have alignment discussions. So if one person rates their confidence at hitting the KR as green and another person as red, that's pretty interesting. Have a discussion about it, figure it out. And finally, everybody will have visibility into the work actually happening. And by having work witnessed, it's a natural motivator for us as team members. Like, hey, I know the rest of the team knows when things are going well, and also that when things are not going well, they know about it and can jump in and help out and correct course when needed. So yeah, again, you're going to have the prioritization discussions just naturally out of doing this very simple process. If you can't get it all done, which ones are you going to choose as most important? And then also, hey, wow, we're not on track for hitting this goal. But marketing just came in with a request for some website changes that they really need some engineering help on. It could be really important, or it could be getting in the way of actually solving the thing that will change the company. And so by constantly reviewing the goals, it'll keep them top of mind, which is the sort of simplest and most important reason to do this is if we simply review the goals, we'll remember what they are and make prioritization decisions ourselves about the work that we're doing each day. Second, that active judgment. So of providing a confidence score. When you judge something and are asked your opinion and have a voice, you naturally feel more ownership of it. So it's, hey, I think it's not on track, or I think it's on track. I feel ownership of it. And it also forces you to think through the plan. So is it on track? Well, let me think about all the activities that happen this week and what's coming next week. That act naturally gets you to think about all of it. We talked about the alignment issue. And then what every engineering leader wants is to get bad news more quickly. I think we've all had releases where even when you do that, hey, we have some spreadsheet somewhere where, things are red, yellow, green. The project is green all the way up until 2 weeks before release. And then suddenly it's yellow, and then it's red, and then it's going to be shipping a month later. The more you do this behavior and ask the right people the right questions, you can create a culture of sharing bad news much earlier. And when you do, then you actually have the opportunity to make some changes. So briefly, is it okay to change your goals midstream? The short answer is yes. We'll talk about really briefly some ways to decide when it's okay. So sometimes you'll learn something in the middle that wildly changes all of your assumptions. And when that's the case, reality is simply different, and not changing your goals is going to feel like to the team of not acknowledging reality. And when that's the case, change the goal. It's okay. Slightly related, sometimes you'll realize that there's actually something different that is much more important. And when that's the case, cancel the goal and set a brand new one. And then also very common, and this is why the general advice is, hey, don't change a goal unless you really have to, is if the team isn't executing well, you don't want to just simply keep lowering the standards. You want to create a culture and environment where it's okay to fail and learn from that. And so if the team isn't executing well, if you really feel like you don't need to change it, then don't leave the goal, keep measuring it. And whether you change it or not, at the end of the period, review the goals that you originally set, as well as the change goals, and use that as part of the learning process about how to do it better next time. And finally, we chatted about this a little bit before. If you keep feeling like you have to change your goals, maybe you're setting them to be too long, maybe try switching from quarterly to monthly for at least a set of them.
And I think the other piece, this was the quick anecdote that we talked about before. There's also a situation where leadership might be influenced by others as well. So I've had situations in the past working with founders where they read a leadership book like Blue Origins or Blue Oceans, and they think, oh, okay, we're gonna, change the whole projection of the team and the company vision, and you spend an entire day kind of resetting all of your goals. And then 3 days later, they have a dinner with someone who says, oh no, don't do that, do this instead. And then comes in and kind of torpedoes it all over again. So as an engineering manager, if you're dealing, I think it's also good to be thinking about managing up as well as managing down for your team. So how would you encourage engineering managers to handle situations like that?
Yeah, no, as a leader, you have to realize that when you do change a goal, that has a lot of overhead to it. You're telling everybody that what was important is no longer important, and you're forcing a long set of conversation realignment. And so there are cases that the story you tell is a pretty good example of bad behavior of changing goals. This should not be just on a whim. And if you actually have gone through the hard work of figuring out what is actually most important, that shouldn't change that much unless you do truly learn brand new data that fundamentally changes the worldview. So we should always realize there's a very high cost of changing goals. So if you are going to do it, just make sure that it's actually worth it. So this again is the sort of quick tips, things that I wished had been shared with me earlier. We talked about this first one, which is if you can, let your team members decide which KRs they're going to lead. You'll get awesome behaviors out of that. In some cases, there's not really a choice or it's really obvious who needs to lead it. That's okay too. The second one is please don't link OKRs to your performance management. And I get bummed out when OKRs are synonymous with performance management processes. And if that's true at your company, you maybe need to not call them OKRs and call it team goals or something. And there's a couple of obvious reasons why this can be kind of a trap. The first is if your pay raise or your promotion is linked to the goals that you're going to be measured on, what are you going to do? You're going to set lower goals and you won't actually stretch for doing something amazing because you know, hey, I better hit these things. Otherwise, I'm being judged on them and I'm going to be paid less or I won't get the promotion. So if you want that behavior of actually achieving amazing results, don't connect judgment directly to the process. And then the second piece, back to what we talked about with the book Drive, the best way to kill intrinsic motivation is to set some explicit carrot and sticks around the process. And so keep them separate. And if your HR organization does have this elaborate process of judging people based on personal goals, I'm sorry. There are some positive ways to do it as well, but keep your team goals separate of that. Really work on creating, as third point, a culture where it's okay to deliver bad news and where it's actually the person's responsibility to do it. So one great engineering leader that I've worked with has a saying, which is a little bit harsh, but I think also totally the right actually spirit, which is, hey, if you tell me there's a problem 2 weeks before we ship, it's my problem. I'm going to handle it and I'm going to deal with it because you did your job of telling me that it's a problem. But guess what? If you tell me that there's a problem 2 days before we ship, it's your problem and you better damn fix it because you probably knew about this and we're just hiding it until you figured you couldn't tell me any later. So figure out the right way of creating that culture, but you want to make it okay to share bad news early. When you do this goal confidence and the ratings and do red, yellow, green, or whatever you decide on, actually spend a little bit of time discussing the norms of what that means as a team. So, is it okay for a goal to sit as yellow for more than a few weeks? I've worked with some teams where they've decided, hey, a goal and subjective rating can only be yellow for 2 weeks in a row. And after that, it better get to green or we're going to call it red because there's actually problems we need to jump on immediately. And then we've talked about this previously in the webinar. Goals are not the same as your plan, but it's a really positive behavior to explicitly link the plan to each of the KRs so that everybody does have visibility into it. And you can use the goals check-in as a context for reviewing the plan and getting ideas from people about changes you might want to make to that plan. And Ashley, time check, we're running a little bit low on time, is that right?
Yes, we have about 10 minutes left and we want to leave a couple minutes for Q&A.
Perfect. we're going to cover this last topic pretty quickly so we can get to questions. And it's the third part of the goal lifecycle. It's a really simple idea, which is most of the time teams spend a little bit of time in planning, and then they spend the rest of it in execution, and they never actually give themselves the time to do learning. And that's how you actually improve. And so it's a very simple thing I propose is formally include a learning step into your goal setting process. A lot of engineering teams do this around releases with retrospectives or postmortems. You can do some simple behaviors around your goal setting process to drive a continual learning and positive feedback process. So how to do this? First, actually take the time to celebrate when you achieve a goal and provide some public recognition to the leads as well as all the supporting players. And whereas giving somebody monetary reward and linking it to performance management process can kind of confuse things with extrinsic rewards. Recognition can be priceless, and knowing that the hard work that you did is recognized by your peers in the company is an amazing motivator and can get your team addicted to the process of winning. You should definitely have an explicit goals retrospective. And when you do, rate each of the goals. So how do we do at setting this KR? How do we do at setting this objective? Was this actually the most important thing? Was it the right level of difficulty? Just have a brief discussion about it. And then very importantly, make it okay to stretch and fail. There is this natural instinct as leaders, like, oh, we don't want to talk about our failures. It just feels bad. It's a downer. If instead you talk about it in the context of, hey, how do we learn how to do it better next time? And it's okay that we didn't achieve it. Why didn't we achieve it? How do we do better next time? That is what creates the learning cycle. So that's it. I hope there were some tidbits in that whole goal lifecycle discussion, from setting them to living with them each week to actually creating a learning feedback loop that all of you can take to your own teams and your own goal setting processes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. Let me pop up the Q&A box. And if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to pop them in there. I'll tackle the first one here. So it feels natural that engineering and product goals are tied. Again, as an example, delivering an MVP and ideating the MVP. So do you recommend separating them, considering them, but setting them separately, making them more cohesive?
Yeah, there's no one right answer, at least that I know of. But one thing you might try is having an objective that is shared by engineering and product, and then having individual KRs that either product is leading or that engineering is leading. And that also becomes a natural way, like, hey, when we're actually discussing this objective, we have to get engineering and product together to talk about it because there are different leads in each of these KRs. So you'll have better synchronization and alignment between product and engineering when you do that. And it'll be clear, like, hey, engineering actually is driving a lot of this. There are some execution things that are part of our KRs. So I would try that as a first recommendation is, when appropriate, have an objective shared by product and engineering, or you can go the slightly more extreme path of actually organizing your teams into pod structures where you embed product and engineering and design all together. And that might be the right fit for your company.
Let's see, we've got one more question. How do you increase adoption enterprise/company-wide?
Of a goals process, I would assume.
Yeah, he doesn't specify. If you want to specify, we can add. So I would say go ahead and tackle.
So certainly it helps to have leadership care about a goals process and to drive that. I think if you are an engineering leader, it is very possible to have a goals process that is just for engineering, and maybe you're going to rope in product and design. So as a research and development kind of pseudo team, you're driving a set of goals. And if that's all that you have support for in your organization, that would be okay. And even if you're an engineering manager, but your whole company doesn't have an explicit set of goals, I hope that you at least have a specific set of priorities.
Right.
And if not, you can ask your boss, like, hey, what's most important? And you could still do a OKR process inside of your team, which is no reason you can't. You might not get all the value of the OKRs process organization-wide, but you can have some of the behaviors of the weekly check-ins, and more formal, like, hey, there's a lead and we're making it clear who's accountable and who owns this. So I think there's value in even doing it as a single engineering manager and team. And by the way, if you actually make your goals public to the whole company and say, I'm willing to write them down and work out loud, and even though the rest of the company isn't doing this, I'm saying what success looks like, I'm inviting feedback on it, and then publishing out whether we achieve it or not. That's a pretty cool way to inspire change at the rest of your organization. And you might find pretty quickly that your peers and your boss and organization, and then maybe entire company start getting addicted to this behavior as well.
Okay, so we've got a few more that just came in. So how do you ensure quarterly goals do not promote short-sightedness, particularly as it pertains to harder product and business needs?
I think one is make sure that you've actually written down the vision and the mission. So if you haven't, you're probably always going to be a little bit too short-sighted. It depends on the business. In some cases, defining what you want to achieve over the course of a single year or even multiple years can be incredibly valuable, and maybe that is slightly different than the mission and the vision. There's an example in John Doerr's OKR book, Measure What Matters, about the goal that YouTube set around having this incredible number of minutes watched of video, and how they lived with that objective over the course of many years and set a continually evolving set of KRs. So it's definitely okay to do that, but if you at least set that, hey, here's the direction that we're trying to do. For most teams, if you're doing quarterly goals, I don't think you're probably going to have too big of a problem of, hey, we're being short-sighted about it.
And this one, can you talk about the relationship between OKRs and product roadmaps?
It's a great question.
Big question.
Yeah. So hopefully there's at least a fair amount of alignment. So in our case, for example, at Koan right now, we have a key result and an objective that has directly informed our product roadmap over the next 6 weeks. And we've chosen a set of things to build that we believe will lead to accomplishing the metrics in our key results. So in other words, they're explicitly linked. At other times, there's a big new release or a big new feature that we're shipping where we actually think it has value to be measuring it in this check-ins process. And so we just put it as a binary key result as part of our objective and plan, and that's okay too. But they are separate documents, and in particular, there are things you're going to be doing in your roadmap that are part of that, like just keep the business running. So whether you organize things into boulders and rocks and pebbles, like there's stuff that you're going to be working on as an engineering team that's part of your roadmap that might not be related to your goals, and that's because there's just a steady state of stuff that you need to be doing to keep the business functioning. And that is, in some cases, different than, hey, here's the fundamental change that we're going to drive. It's okay to have both.
Cool. Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I do have one last question that we ask on all our webinars. But what does mentorship mean to you, and why is it important in developing a team?
Yeah, if any of you are not participating in Plato mentoring already, I think you absolutely should, either as a mentor or as a mentee. And I mentor folks. I also have I'm a mentee as well. And for me as a mentee, it's I can learn from people that have been through this before and solve problems much faster than I ever would myself, and be exposed to things and challenged in ways that I never could have been otherwise. As a mentor, it's this incredible opportunity to get satisfaction out of, hey, I had to go through this really hard thing. If I can just make it a tiny bit easier for you or challenge you on this thing, that feels incredibly rewarding. And also, it turns out that you learn an enormous amount by talking about other people's challenges and clarifies your own thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Matt, for being here today and sharing all of this amazing information. We hope everybody got some actionable advice that you can take back to your teams and hopefully set more effective goals that are aligned. If you're interested in chatting one-on-one with more Plato mentors like Matt, you can sign up for a demo at platohq.com. And thank you all so much again for attending, and we'll see you on the next one.